Hello and welcome to the American Library in Paris. Welcome to Ecologues, the series of Ecologues. I'm Alice McCrum, head of all adult cultural programming here at the library. Before we get started in full force and before I pass over to Maria, is it anyone's first time at the library this evening? And if so, could you raise your hand? Hello, welcome. Thank you for being here with us. I am going to pass it to Maria, who's going to introduce not only this fantastic series, but also tonight's speakers and the topic for tonight. So Maria, over to you.
Thank you, Alice. Yes, make sure I'm on the screen here. Hello, everyone. I'm Maria Krasinski. I am the managing director of News Decoder, who is one of the partners of the Ecologues series, graciously hosted by the American Library in Paris. And we are at the end of the road for those who have been with us from the very beginning. This is the sixth talk and final talk in the Ecologues climate conversation series. We started all the way back in January when it was dark and gray and bleak, and here we are now. It's still going to be light out when we end. And what a journey it has been. And I know many of you have been with us through all sessions. We started with an introduction to the climate crisis. What is this that we're talking about, and trying to break it down into a sort of digestible, approachable topic. And we moved through climate justice, economics, energy, food. I may have missing one, but really just have covered quite a range. And we've had such tremendous speakers with us. I think 16 thus far, and our 3 speakers tonight makes it 19 who have so generously shared their immense expertise and knowledge and really sparked dialogue. The last talk we had was on economics. Maybe 3 people in the room were economists, and everyone else was just sort of curious and interested, and they brought this really high level expertise and dissenting opinions and perspectives, and really created a space for talking about these ideas, talking about new approaches. And that's really the goal of this series. So we thank you all for joining us on this journey. And just to say that Ecologues is part of a larger project called the Writings on the Wall, which is an initiative of the Climate Academy in Brussels, News Decoder here in Paris, our wonderful partner, the American Library in Paris for Ecologues. And the goal of this project is really to create innovative ways to talk and teach about climate change, Ecologues being a key piece of that. And all of these talks are recorded, so if this is your first time, you can catch up on all the other conversations. They live on the American Library's YouTube channel, News Decoder's website, along with accompanying educational resources. If you're a teacher, you can bring it into the classroom. And we're just so delighted to have this for our inaugural series with the library. So thank you, Alice, and your team. So with that, we will get to tonight's topic. We are wrapping up the series with a look at law, which really does touch all elements of our previous conversations, the legal ramifications, which our speakers will get into. And I am going to cheat and look at my phone here. We have such wonderful speakers. I want to make sure I get their accolades just so. So joining us here in person at the library, who came in from London, is Tim Crosland. And Tim is the director of Plan B, which advances strategic legal action to tackle climate change. Plan B was established in 2016 following the adoption of the Paris Agreement on climate change to hold to account those in power who knowingly take action inconsistent with the 1.5 degree temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. And Tim brings expertise in international human rights, environmental law, and litigation, and an interdisciplinary partnership-based approach to tackling climate change. So thank you, Tim, for joining us tonight. And joining us on Zoom, up in the cloud there is Linda Sheehan, is Executive Director of Environment Now, where she guides work to protect and restore California's coastal freshwater and forest ecosystems for the benefit of all Californians. Previously, Linda was an independent consultant to California state agencies and national philanthropies, serving as Leonardo DiCaprio's foundation, as senior counsel for Leonardo DiCaprio's foundation and grants manager. She built and implemented nature's rights programs as executive director and co-founder of Earth Law Center, oversaw the California Coastkeeper Alliance as executive director, and guided the Ocean Conservancy's work as Pacific Region director. Just bringing a lot of experience to the table tonight. And then we are also joined by Irmak Kanyılmaz, who is a student at the European School of Brussels II and an active member of the Climate Academy, who I mentioned is a partner and sponsor of the Ecologues talk. And with the Climate Academy, Irmak has spoken widely about her involvement with climate and climate activism. Recently, she presented at La Semaine de l'Éco-Citoyenneté, pardon my French. And she's also a News Decoder student ambassador, so she's very involved with our global student network and was a leader and speaker in a cross-border webinar on planetary boundaries in partnership with a school in California. So with that, we have quite a lot of expertise on the panels today, so I'm going to stop talking and turn it back to you.
Thank you. Can we have a round of applause for Maria, for tonight's speakers for the series? Thank you. Since we have, there's a note to make before we jump into the conversation, which is that this conversation will last for 90 minutes and include you for the last half an hour. So we'll talk for roughly 60 minutes, and then we'll open up to audience questions, comments. We really like this to be as kind of engaged and lively as possible, so do not hesitate to ask anyone anything. Let's go first to Linda, because each of tonight's speakers have prepared a opening remark or remarks. And so Linda, tuning in from California, where it's quite early in the morning, is going to kick us off. So Linda, over to you, and thank you for joining us here in Paris.
And thank you so much, Alice, and the team in the American Library in Paris and News Decoder for taking up this important conversation and allowing me to participate today. I'm looking forward to hearing the other remarks as well, and the questions. As a quick overview, I wanted to highlight only briefly how ecological degradation is accelerating. We're facing a sixth mass extinction. Ocean acidification is increasing at the fastest rate in over 300 million years. And the United Nations has found that climate change is pushing us to what they call an unlivable world. Here in the United States, our half-century-old environmental laws are finally showing their age, unable to stop the onslaught, let alone reverse it. As an advocate, I at first blamed the usual suspects for the inability of our environmental laws to protect us from these impacts. These types of roadblocks include well-funded industry opposition, agency bureaucracies, overwhelmed courts, increasingly conservative judges, and a lack of effective public outreach and engagement. But I realized over time that there's a more entrenched reason for our environmental laws' inability to address these modern challenges, and that is the law's framing and the assumptions that go with that framing. There are two primary framing perspectives. First is the current frame, which views natural systems as separate from us, commodities that are primarily property to be traded for profit. This is the frame that our current environmental laws are grounded in and serve. The second framing perspective views natural systems as interconnected with us, a subject rather than an object of our laws, a community to which we belong. Under this second frame, our societal goal is not to maximize short-term economic profit as we do today, but instead to become a mutually enhancing presence upon the earth, giving back more than we take, rather than taking far more than we give. These two frames are examples of legal philosophy, also called jurisprudence. Earth jurisprudence, which is a term that was made famous by cultural historian Thomas Berry, refers to an earth-centered philosophy of law. An earth jurisprudence philosophical frame generates earth-centered laws, including laws that recognize the inherent rights of nature to exist, thrive, and evolve. Just as we recognize inherent human rights as arising from our existence on Earth, so too should we logically and morally recognize the inherent rights of nature, our fellow Earth citizen. Recognition of nature's inherent rights begins to reframe law and ethics. It challenges the worldview of nature as primarily an object to be owned and degraded. One example of this difference in practice is the U.S. Endangered Species Act, which helps prevent species from being extinguished. But it does not kick in until economic forces that have pushed species towards almost extinction have almost succeeded, creating a situation in which those same economic forces actively resist the restoration of those species. By contrast, an Earth-centered legal system would generate not an Endangered Species Act, but a Healthy Species Act, which would set a much higher bar for species flourishing and would guide our use of those species and their habitats to be consistent with our mutual well-being. In my 15 years of involvement with rights of nature, the movement has grown tremendously. Currently, the rights of nature are recognized in law at some level in 24 nations worldwide, including across 15 US states. The website ecojurisprudence.org maps these and other ecological laws worldwide. I'll pause for now, and I look forward to digging into these issues more deeply during our conversation and the following questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Can we have a round of applause? This is brilliant. You've anticipated some of the questions that I'm going to ask you, but as you said, there's much more to dig into the specificities of what rights of nature looks like in practice and in different countries and cultural contexts. Before we dig in, as it were, Tim, over to you and your opening remarks.
Okay, thank you so much, Alice and Maria and Cara for inviting me to be here, and to all of you for being here. And Linda too for very interesting opening remarks. From my perspective, where does a lawyer begin on something like this? We begin by looking at the evidence. That's where, as a profession, we say we like to start. We're above politics, aren't we? We're independent of politics. We just look at the evidence. So let's begin with that. And first of all, the evidence of what is happening, or not what is happening, what we are doing to the world around us. Linda has covered some of that. I imagine most of you are familiar with that. It's not just what the science is telling us about the critical tipping points. We're seeing it, aren't we? We see it all around the world. It's not just what was happening in Pakistan, or the famine in the Horn of Africa, or Afghanistan. We've seen villages decimated in Germany, in France, in Luxembourg, floods in the UK. You'd have to be blind not to see it. You'd have to choose not to see it, not to see it. There's the evidence of what our governments and the fossil fuel companies have known. They knew this was happening in the 50s and the 60s, and they launched deliberate campaigns to conceal that from us. We've got that. And then there's the evidence of what is happening now, what humans are doing now after all those 27 rounds of the conference of the parties and all the lawyers and all the backslapping and all the congratulations. Global emissions of carbon dioxide are just rising as if none of those meetings had ever happened. So that's the basic snapshot of the evidence. And accepting what Linda has said about needing to reframe laws and to get over that false separation between humanity and our environment, let's just look at that evidence through the lens of our ordinary legal systems that we're familiar with. If people do something knowing it's going to cause irreversible, immeasurable harm to others, and they do that knowingly, and they carry on doing it, under what legal system is that okay? That is a crime. It's a civil breach of civil law. We've got plenty of mechanisms within our legal systems, even our own Western traditions of law, ideas of duty of care, trust, human rights obligations, which includes positive obligations to take practical and effective measures to safeguard life. What is the first principle of international law? That one state doesn't permit activity to take place on its territory that harms the territory of another state. That is existing law. Are those laws being upheld? Well, I'm going to talk from the perspective of the UK, which is what I am best able to talk about. You often hear UK politicians say, well, we're just a tiny part of the problem in the UK, just 1% of emissions. It's, India and China. Well, actually, the City of London supports 15% of global emissions around the world as a financial center. That is a vast amount for a relatively small country. Law Students for Climate Accountability have just revealed that the top law firms in London have supported $1.5 trillion of fossil fuel, trillion pounds worth of fossil fuel transactions since 2018. And the Energy Charter Treaty, not many people have heard about that in the UK. £100 billion have been paid to fossil fuel companies in compensation by our governments for their inadequate climate policies that have harmed those companies' profits. The UK ignores the scientific advice, grants new oil and gas licenses when all the scientists say you cannot do that. And we are locking up young people, putting them in prison. One day in September last year, 50 climate people standing up for all of us were sent to prison just for their protests. What about those fossil fuel directors? Are any of them in prison? No. So I'm going to stop there. That's a long opening statement, but that is the evidence of where we are.
Thank you very much. We have a round of applause too. Okay, Irmak, over to you. Would you like to present some opening remarks about your relationship to this topic, why you chose to study at the Climate Academy, why this issue speaks to you and people in your generation?
Yes, of course. Firstly, I'm really happy to be here with you and with these two amazing speakers. I have had the chance to discover in their work too. So I'm going to give, I hope, a good representation of what the youth can think about climate change legislation and the difficulties we can have to make us voice heard. I hope also that I'm going to be able to share clearly less technical knowledge, but more empirical situation I have been through with the Climate Academy and also with my school in general. So yes, this is basically it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, a round of applause. And that's something to highlight too, that in all of these conversations we've had intergenerational dialogue, which we think is really important about this topic in particular. So it's great that Irmak's with us this evening. Linda, let's go back to you briefly, because Maria read a brief biography of you, but of course there's much more to say, and we would be curious, I'm certainly curious, if you could speak briefly to how you ended up where you are now. You started by studying chemical engineering, and then you weaved to public policy and then to law. Can you maybe talk about your background and how these different twists and turns have led to the work that you're doing today?
Sure, absolutely. And actually, my work began when I was actually quite young. The neighborhood that I lived in had a small creek, and upstream in Massachusetts at the time were some old tanneries, some still in operation, some not. And they would have accidents, and the creek would get very contaminated and the fish would die. And so that, as a small child, bothered me, as you can imagine. And at the same time, we were going through not only Earth Day, but also the passage of the US environmental laws I referenced earlier, which were major steps forward, even though they're showing their age today. At the time, they were very significant. And I was caught up with all of these movements and changes and legal advancements as a way to address the problems in my creek and also water pollution more broadly. I've always been interested in water pollution, but of course, climate change is just one indication of the frailty of our laws in being able to address these problems. So when I went to school, I actually had planned to go to law school and public policy school, but thought that I would start with a technical background because the problem is complex and I wanted to be able to make sure that I was addressing it the best way I could. So back then they didn't have environmental engineering. So chemical engineering was the closest that I could get to. And then from there went to law and public policy school and then started working in environmental law and have been doing that ever since. So it was really just started from, seeing pollution that impacted me personally, and then also being inspired as a kid. And I think this is an important lesson for students of all ages, that the outreach that you do can really make a significant difference, and it certainly did for me.
Thank you. I want to ask you just a brief follow-up, which is that since we have some public policy students in the audience from Sciences Po, notably, how did you understand, why public policy and law, and how do you understand the relationship between these two degrees and as it served you in your career?
I see, the way that this started in my career is the law is sort of a macro tool for, at least for me, just sort of how guide you in a certain direction, whereas public policy is the more micro tool, where once you sort of get that guidance and those legal structures in place, then you go off and figure out, okay, how do I do that? And I picked chemical engineering because engineering is very practical, and I like to see how things are implemented. And so for me, the public policy aspect of it was a way to make sure these things happen, because just because you pass a law or win a court case doesn't mean that you're done. And the public policy fills in those gaps.
Thank you. Tim, over to you. A similar question. Can you tell us a bit about your legal background, given that you've just described how UK lawyers are implicated in the system that we're talking about? Talk about maybe your career, your education, how that culminated in the founding of Plan B in 2016.
Sure. So I think I was very implicated in the system. I trained as a human rights lawyer and was in private practice for a while. And then one day, I was in Holland actually, and just found out our first child was on her way, and it's like, I need to get a proper job. And I saw an advert for the police saying, we want a human rights lawyer. And everyone around me said, why would you go and work for the police? Because that's not a place where human rights get respected. I just thought, well, it's interesting, they're advertising for a human rights lawyer. And so I went along, and for some years, and that was a period of like a lot of conflict, but it taught me something that I thought was, interesting about the power in holding people to account for their words. So the police wanted to appear to care about human rights. So they had all these statements everywhere about we uphold human rights in the UK and around the world. And so as the human rights lawyer, when, for example, they were saying we're going to share intelligence with the Americans in Afghanistan because the Americans are asking us for it, well, I could say, well, hang on, that doesn't seem to comply with the human rights law here. We know what the Americans are going to do with that. They're just going to start shooting people because we've got the evidence around that. And that was a difficult thing for the police to respond to, because they've got all these statements. This is what we say we do. And there was only so long, that was an interesting project, but it was an interesting project. And I ended up leaving that and coming to Paris for COP21, where the world signs off this agreement. I was at that point acting as a lawyer for some of the small island states who didn't have the resources of the big delegations. And countries commit to upholding the 1.5 degree limit because they tell us and they tell their people, if we don't do this, the implications are catastrophic. And so then the power as a lawyer of holding people to account for those words and saying, well, did you mean it or did you not? That's what led me to Plan B.
Thank you. Irmak, a similar question to you too, just to give us a larger sense of your background. When did you become interested in this issue, and as it's culminated in being a student at the Climate Academy, and maybe speak a little bit more to your experience at the Academy and how your work and your study there has led to interventions outside the walls of the school too?
Yes, of course. To be honest, I was not really, I had no knowledge about climate change apart from the basics that we are taught in school, which is not sufficient. And I found myself in the Climate Academy by chance, to be honest. It was my teacher who asked me to become a part of it. And this is how I met with the, how to say it, with the grandeur of the situation. The Climate Academy, what we do basically is at first we learn about systemic application to climate change. So we are taught climate change from a more systemic point of view. Basically, the whole point is that casting our objectives into law is really important to have concrete actions to basically reduce the heating of the planet, but also all of the other thresholds, the planetary boundaries that are existing right now. So this is what we do first. We learn more about theory, to put it briefly. But then we have had the chance to have more field practice, I would say. This last March, we went to the European Parliament to talk with Green MEPs, European Parliament members. And it was a really interesting experience, but there are two things that I was able to retrieve from this experience. The first one is that basically there is no transparency coming from politicians in general. But this was not such a big surprise, but seeing it in action was a real eye-opener. To give a really concrete example, I remember at one point being told that numbers are not important, law is not important, policies are not important. What is important is that we do things and that Europe is far ahead from other countries in implementing solutions for climate change. Even though this could be argued, of course. And the second observation I was able to make is kind of linked to the first one. We really, as young people, we lack knowledge concerning all the legal jargon, basically. And when you are not educated enough on a subject, it is really difficult to be able to be a part of a discussion and to be, aware of your rights as a citizen. Um, I can just give a concrete example. For example, the Paris Agreement. I remember that in Belgium we had lots of demonstration from young people, from young activists. But for Belgium to ratify the agreement, basically. But when you look more at it, those are actually pledges. So there is nothing really making sure that all of these pledges are being respected or that we are going in the right direction. And when you look at concrete numbers, such as the numbers of catex, you can see that the emissions in CO2 are only increasing. So at least in our Western countries, of course, this disparity and this injustice was, I think, talked about in another Ecologues session. But yes, the fact that we lack the knowledge in legislative terms, in politics, is a big problem in taking part of discussions about it. And I'm lucky to be in a school where we have political science courses and also the Climate Academy, but it's not the case of all young people. And I think that it is a shame because we are deprived of our rights and of our right to basically be able to be a part of a discussion which is going to determine our future.
Thank you. It's what you say is so striking because it seems to me that there are two main issues that you're highlighting. One is lack of access to knowledge at all, and we heard this kind of from Linda saying she wanted to study a certain type of engineering and was forced at that time to choose a different type that was kind of adjacent because the course she was looking for didn't exist. And we might say the same thing of education elsewhere. You know, you want to study the thing at hand, it doesn't exist. Or, as you point out, and maybe this is more difficult and tricky, is that if there is knowledge available to be taught and learnt, it's incredibly abstruse and convoluted, and not even people who were technically trained within the field can understand it. So how would teenagers who are wanting to get involved, how could they understand it? So we're going to go back to you shortly to ask, you know, what are the kind of courses specifically how are taught at the Climate Academy and how are they handling these issues? Linda, I would like to go back to you to make a very good point that you made to me, just so we're kind of on the same page about the expanse of this conversation. We called it Legislating for the Future because it was kind of catchy, but today we really want to talk about all aspects of law and lawmaking, including legislation, of course, but directives, doctrine, process, treaties, litigation, bills, agreements, and so on. And you're particularly interested, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, in the rights of nature movement. You've already defined the terms that I was going to ask you about, but maybe you could now talk about where we're seeing examples of rights of nature popping up. So there was the notable case of Ecuador in 2008, recent cases in New Zealand and India. How is this looking in different cultural contexts, and are we seeing benefits once rights of nature is being implemented in different countries? It's a big question.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, I'll start with giving just a few different examples. And what's interesting about the rights of nature movement, it's really coming from the ground up, or the earth up, as you might say. And so you're seeing very different structures and processes coming about depending on where you are and what the situation is. So as you just mentioned, Ecuador was made the major leader in this movement with its adoption of constitutional amendments in 2008, which set an important precedent for all of the laws and court cases to come. There are a couple of articles that in particular that are worth flagging, Articles 71 and 72, which talk about nature or Pachamama having the right to exist, persist, and maintain and regenerate itself. That's the structure of the rights of nature, but then the implementation part is also reflected in those two articles. One is that any person can demand observation of those rights before a public body. So you could go to court and represent nature where there is a violation. So it's not just rights on paper. And then Article 72 talks about what happens when we do harm. Nature, it says nature has the right to be completely restored, independent of the obligation to compensate. So that means, you know, typically nowadays, if somebody harms a natural system, i.e. a piece of property, they write a check perhaps to the person who owns the property, which may or may not go to restoration. But what this constitutional provision is saying is that nature has its own right to be restored, that it has its own right to be represented in court, and it has its own right to remedy as well. And a couple of examples out of Ecuador more recently that have shown how the existing legal system doesn't work and that rights of nature was essential to change were both related to mining. One was the denial of mining permits for Los Cedros, which is a cloud forest, incredibly beautiful biodiverse cloud forest in Ecuador. And those mining permits were going to go forward without the rights of nature court case moving forward successfully. And much more recently, the Intag Valley, after about 30 years of mining that was incredibly harmful to local people and to the biodiverse ecosystem that was being impacted, a rights of nature court case again stopped that mining in a way that environmental laws just simply couldn't. So we're seeing a lot of movement in Ecuador on rights of nature, in large part because of that constitutional provision. A couple of other very different examples. Colombia is interesting because that's a country that does not have or had not had any rights of nature legal provisions that had been adopted. Their rights of nature law was solely read into the law by the courts in a couple of notable cases. One was the Atrato River, which was found to have rights to clean flow by the Colombia Constitutional Court. And then the Amazon climate rights case, where the Supreme Court of Colombia was responding to a human rights case by young people, children up to young adults. And they said our human rights are being violated by climate change. And the court found, you're right, and also you can't have a human right to a healthy climate unless the natural systems themselves have a right to a healthy climate. So they read rights of nature to a healthy climate into the case where it had not been raised, and it was not also in the law. And then getting to the public policy question that came up earlier, the court said that this needs to be implemented. It called in the government agency to implement it primarily through actions to stop deforestation, which is the main driver of climate change impacts in Colombia. So there's both a judicial law and a public policy component to that decision. And one more interesting thing about that Colombia decision was that it was a tutela action, which is a type of streamlined human rights case, which exists in one form or another in virtually all, if not all, Latin American countries except for Cuba. So there's a lot of opportunity there for additional types of actions for rights of nature that are tied to human rights violations, which is pretty much all of them. Two other quick examples, so I don't take up too much time, and we could talk about them more in depth. New Zealand's rights of nature law is actually treaty-based. There are treaty agreements that were signed with the Maori to remedy long-standing treaty violations of both around the Whanganui River and Te Urewera Forest, among other areas. And in both of those cases, in all of those cases, the approach was more of legal personhood. The river and the forest were recognized as legal entities, a integrated living whole with their own standing, grounded in indigenous jurisprudence that ecosystems are living spiritual beings with intrinsic value. And so that underlying jurisprudence combined with legal personhood is providing the types of indigenous-led rights that are increasingly successful that we're seeing in New Zealand. Last example would be in Santa Monica, California. Again, completely different example, a city in the United States that decided that they wanted to push back on corporate rights and say that natural systems within the city and the people of the city had a right to a healthy climate, to healthy groundwater aquifers, to healthy ocean, just healthy natural systems within Santa Monica. And again, from a public policy perspective, they've been implementing that law, which they passed at the local level, both through administrative actions, through city policies and practices, and then also through additional laws that protect the groundwater more specifically from extraction through private wells. So I'll take a pause there, and we can discuss any of these in more detail.
I should note that you're being very modest, and Linda played a major part in the Santa Monica case and implementation of rights of nature there. So I'll just say that because I imagine you wouldn't. Tim, to go back to you, you mentioned that you founded Plan B in 2016. I suppose the brief question would be, what have you been up to since then?
Well, I'd like to try and connect a little bit to what we've just been hearing from Linda, and rights of nature. I mean, in some ways, you think about that, it feels a bit like some of the polytheist traditions, you know, going back to religions where you have a god of the sea, you have a god of the river, you have a god of the woodland, just ways to remind people that we're interdependent and that web of life is interdependent, and that is the truth, and we should make that truth apparent. The danger, as I see it, with some of the discourse around law and talking about new treaties, is bringing people to believe if only we could have these rights recognized, if only we could have this new treaty on the rights of nature, everything would be okay. And that could stand side by side with our existing political system, more or less. We just need to tweak it a bit here. I don't think that is true. I think it's worth asking why, like coming back to the rainforest, that we all depend on the Amazon, the lungs of the planet in so many ways. It breathes in carbon It exhales oxygen, that vast biodiversity it contains. But then ask what all our political institutions are focused on. They're focused on maximizing economic growth. And you leave that rainforest standing intact, that does nothing for economic growth. You cut it down, you turn it into firewood that people can burn, or soy farms. You make short-term profit, and the politicians can say, look what we've done, we boosted economic growth. So unless our law or legislation is somehow able to challenge that, it's going to end up subordinate to that. And at some point, maybe not now, I'll come on to a particular legal case I was involved in where I feel that relationship between law and politics was very apparent.
You can say it now.
Okay, well, if you think that flows, so one of the cases that Plan B brought was against the UK government for expanding Heathrow Airport. And the government had evidence that that expansion would mean 40 million tons of carbon dioxide just from UK aviation every single year by 2050. That wasn't our evidence, that was the government's own evidence. They knew in 2018 that that was inconsistent with net zero. That was inconsistent with 1.5 degrees in the Paris Agreement that they had signed. And they knew, because they had just had the IPCC's report in 2018, that the implications would be catastrophic. But the government approved it anyway, knowing all of those things on their own evidence. So we took them to court. The Court of Appeal, when they heard the government say, but the Paris Agreement is irrelevant because it's not binding in domestic law, it's an international treaty, and in UK law, that is not binding. The Court of Appeal said, well, that doesn't make sense. I mean, obviously, you should have taken the Paris Agreement into account. That's part of your own policy. You adopted it, you've ratified it. But then we got to the highest court, the Supreme Court, and they said, actually, no, the government was correct. The Paris Agreement, not relevant because international law. And we've heard, you know, Irmak talk about, as a young person, it's difficult to negotiate the jargon, the legalese. How good a lawyer do you need to be to see the problem with that? The conditions which make the planet habitable, 1.5 degrees, are irrelevant because it's international law, not domestic law. You do not have to be educated in jargon to see the problem with that. So why did the Supreme Court, the highest judges in the land, some of the most educated people, why did they come to that decision? They came to that decision because they listened to the government's argument that economic growth demands more trade, more transport. How are we going to have more economic growth in the UK without a bigger airport to make all of that possible? And they subordinated those concerns about the future of our young people, the future of the global south, the people who are dying now, being displaced now. They subordinated that because it was inconsistent with economic growth. So that is the challenge that we face.
And this is just one example of several cases and projects that you're working on. And if we have time, and certainly in the audience questions, I encourage you to ask him about the other work he's doing specifically. It's wonderful that it's apropos that you bring up the economic system, in part because we discussed it at the last Ecologues, and in part because, Irmak, I'm curious, so we're going back to you now. There are 3 pillars of the Climate Academy's mission. You mentioned one of them, civic service. and you also mentioned systemic understanding. There's also systems entrepreneurship. Systemic understanding, it seems to me it's come up several times in this conversation. I know Linda too wanted to talk about the economic model. What do the courses that you're taking in systemic understanding look like? You're taking presumably courses on economics. You mentioned political science. If you could give us a bird's eye view or a fly on the wall glimpse at a course that tackles systems and systems thinking, I think that would be very interesting.
Yes, of course. Firstly, I would say that the economics courses we have is mostly capitalist propaganda, so nothing much about climate change or we don't really mention these kind of issues in those courses. It's mostly during the periods we have with the Climate Academy, and they are only optional. So it's kind of like a club, but more like a class, I would say. So yes, we have manuals which were written by our teachers and also by experts and scientists working in reports for the IPCC. I would say that there is not a clear structure of how every course goes, but during the political science courses, we have a broad view on how the European Parliament's works, how in general councils go on, how decisions are made, what are the steps for passing on a law. This is the kind of information we get. And during the courses of the Climate Academy, we mostly talk about issues going on right now. For example, we were talking about France and the decision of Emmanuel Macron lastly to put on pause the legislation on climate law and this kind of stuff. We also talk a lot about the IPCC reports. Actually, last April, a French journalist published about the backgrounds of IPCC reports and how political figures have a say on the informations which are put on a purely scientific based research report, which is really which shouldn't happen. So we mostly talk about concrete situations going on around us, mostly in Europe, and then we dive deeper into these issues. So it is more concrete, not so abstract, and we can still continue to be informed on the on the fishy things going on around us, basically.
Thank you. Linda, let's go back to you. We have 10 more minutes of this part of the conversation before, as I promised, we'll turn to half an hour of audience questions. There's a lot to pack in part because Tim mentioned that maybe rights of nature isn't always successful in every case, or is it always useful in every case? Perhaps you can defend rights of nature approach. I mean, this is a paraphrasing, but also highlight the areas in which maybe it's not the best approach to take, given that there is this standing political order that isn't changing. I know that you wanted to talk about economics, so maybe you can also talk about that. And then if you could also talk about the work that you're working on right now as Executive Director of Environment Now with the water flow advancement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I really welcome this discussion of economics because I think it's just so critical and central to some of the issues. And where I think rights of nature helps is, in particular, is disaggregating the framing, as I mentioned earlier, of how we think not just about law, but about economics and our societal goals more generally. A colleague once mentioned, Michael McGonigal, that this is what he called an adjective noun problem. It illustrates how ideas of success are so entrenched that we don't see them for what they are. So when we talk about things that are allegedly solutions, like sustainable development, green economy, blue economy, natural capital, if you look at the noun, capital, economy, development, that tells you what your priority is. It tells you what society's priority is. It's the economic system. And then the things that are supposed to be helpful for the environment, this idea of sustainable or green or natural, those are adjectives. Those are really the throwaway. So they illustrate that our economic system is upside down. We assume that the ultimate goal is to protect the economic system and help it grow. Just like any other system tries to grow and be strong, the economic system does the same. But the problem is that it's really nested inside an overarching Earth, a planet, and that humans are one part of that. And the economic system is just something we made up. It's not the thing that should be driving us. So laws that fundamentally accept and don't even see a problem with that are going to face more challenges than rights of nature systems that don't. So for example, there's a great book that's on open access that you could read for free out of MIT Press called The Politics of Rights of Nature. And it goes into some of these issues. And it says the most success that they see with rights of nature systems are those that are grounded in earth jurisprudence or earth-centered philosophies of law, particularly from indigenous perspectives, indigenous rights of law. So the Ecuador Constitution was put forward by indigenous peoples in large part. Their reference to Pachamama is an indigenous concept. So we've seen some success in Ecuador in part because of that. We're also seeing, for example, in the legal personhood approach, New Zealand's legal personhood approach is succeeding in part because it's grounded in an indigenous concept of economics and ecosystems as economic serving ecosystems, as living spiritual beings. Whereas contrasting California, which you just mentioned, if we used a legal personhood approach in California and gave waterways the standing of legal persons with some water rights, under California law, those would probably be junior water rights if you looked at the law the way it is right now. And so we'd be at the bottom of the list, and waterways might even be worse off than they are right now. You need a framing that recognizes that waterway health and waterway needs and human and cultural needs need to be pushed up to the top of the list, contrary to what our existing economics-driven system is. So we have a couple of real successes most recently that we've been supporting in California, including petition to the State Water Board to create the first minimum flow standards in the state on one particular river, and to also take down dams in Northern California to protect waterway flows. And both of these are very positive movements forward, but neither of them guarantees minimum flows. Neither of them guarantees healthy flows. They may guarantee some minimum flow, but that's not necessarily enough, especially with climate change and the impacts that we're going to be seeing on these waterways and systems. We need a higher bar, and that comes from a different framing, a different perspective of our relationship with nature.
Thank you. So the argument is essentially these advances would be enhanced by a rights of nature approach. But to go back to Tim's point, how tenable actually is that to reframe in this way? I mean, would it be possible in every single case, and would it even be useful in every single case?
It's certainly possible because we've seen it happening in Ecuador in the two examples, for example, that Los Cedros and Integ Valley. And in both of those cases, it was incredibly useful. Those were major advances that would have caused enormous damage that would not have occurred but for the rights of nature provisions in the Constitution. And these things, I've been working in this for 15 years, and it's been exponential growth in the movement. And it's incredibly exciting for me to be able to be watching that and thinking back to, human rights advances. In the United States, it took 100 years for women to earn the right to vote. It's something so simple as the right to vote took that long of a time. So we need to take the advances that we're having, learn from them, and then move forward in the best way that we can, knowing that the alternative is something that we really don't want for ourselves and for the future generations to come.
Thank you. I hadn't heard of this adjective noun distinction. I think it's really interesting, and I'd like to use it to ask Tim my next question, because we're here in part talking about environmental law and using this modifier: green law, environmental legislation, environmental litigation. What if law itself, what if the courts themselves are the problem noun, as it were? So you asked me, you wanted to speak about this. This is the kind of hard-hitting question as we come to the end of this part of the conversation. Are the law and the courts part of the solution to the climate crisis, or are they part of the problem?
Well, it's a good question. Just coming back to the, the big picture on that, you think about broadly what our courts are doing, they are legitimizing the destruction of our common home. They're legitimizing the destruction of the conditions which make our planet habitable. Those emissions keep going up because it's lawful, as in the courts are saying that is okay. And they are criminalizing those people who get into movements and say, we are going to take action on behalf of ourselves, on behalf of the people we love, the lands that we love, the life that we love. We are going to do something because we've got to do something. And those people are being criminalized. So that is, if you come back to, I mean, it's a question, isn't it? Maybe a deeper question than we've got time for. What is the purpose of law? But it's a proper question to ask. I think most of us would say, well, isn't the law meant to protect us in some way? Isn't it meant to prevent harm? But if it's doing the opposite, if it's legitimizing the harm and criminalizing the people trying to stop it, the law itself has lost its way. The law has betrayed its purpose. It's been turned upside down. And I hear, Irmak's call to be concrete and to avoid jargon, but there's just one, as we're in a library here, just going to introduce, a slightly abstract, another distinction. A critique called Jameson talked about immanent critique versus transcendent critique. Immanent critique is where you expose a system by showing the internal contradictions within a system. Transcendent critique is where you call it out from outside the system. So you say, this capitalist system that we have, it concentrates power. It builds in and accelerates inequity. It takes us all to destruction. It has inherent a kind of death wish. That's transcendent critique. As a lawyer in front of domestic courts in the UK, for example, if I talk about Mother Nature, they're going to say, oh, well, you don't understand our legal tradition here. That's going to work better in Ecuador because that's deeper in the culture. It's deeper in the culture in India, the connection to the world around you, very separated from that in the UK. So the immanent critique is to invoke more familiar principles like the duty of care to your people. But the short answer is yes, law is the problem, and we have got it the wrong way round at the moment, and that's what has to change.
I wonder what you would say to, we're kind of missing another participant here. This is an environmental lawyer who has the same goals as you, who hasn't stepped out of the system yet. They're still very much working in the system. They would call themselves an environmental lawyer, and they're saying, I'm doing my best. I'm doing my best with the tools that I have. I've been doing this for 30 years, and it's a noble effort. And you would say,
I would say we need to be building from our new systems. So we need to be getting people to imagine a world where we have rights of nature, where we properly respect rights around the world internationally, where we really sincerely treat each other as equals, our brothers and sisters around the world. We need to imagine that. So work that helps people to imagine that is vital, as long as we don't mislead people into thinking that can coexist with a deeply destructive system, because that then acts as a fig leaf. So of course, work to develop the rights of nature. I mean, I applaud that for sure.
thank you. Irmak, you have the final word, because that's the order that we've been going in, and also because you're the member of the youngest generation. So you will truly have the final word in the global conversation. Would you like to add anything What are your final thoughts as we turn to audience questions?
Yes, of course. I would just like to say that it was really interesting to hear Tim and Lydia talk about their experience. And I think that they put their finger on a really, how to say it, important and um, important matter. It's the fact that in our Western countries, we have this really anthropologic point of view. I mean, even the solutions for climate change should benefit us. So I think that it is interesting to hear both of their perspective on if one day we are going to be able to stop having this point of view, this perspective that everything should, how to say it, give a service to us, basically. And if we are going to be able to live in cohesion with nature. So yes, this is what I would say. I hope that we will arrive to have successful achievements, even though I'm kind of skeptic, but yes.
Thank you. Can we have a big round of applause, please, for all of tonight's speakers? Thank you. I imagine the Zoom audience is virtually applauding, although there is a way to do that. So if you can maybe virtually applaud, that would be great. So Linda and Irmak can see that. Yeah, we have half an hour of audience questions. Are there in-person questions? If you're in the Zoom audience, as I will call out again, please do post questions or comments in the chat. And Alfonso has the mic, so he'll come to you.
I have a question coming back to what was said about like the government's not complying or even working against us. And is there any advice you, all of your speakers, would have from both the young perspective and not so young perspective, if I may say? How can we still continue working and achieving results if it seems like the system is against us and the law is not working as it's supposed to, the governments are not working? What would you advise other people?
Sure. Sorry, the opposite. Governments only have power because we go along with it to some extent. Enough people withdraw and find ways not to cooperate, well, they're no longer the effective government. And of course, let's be realistic, that, you know, that hardly answers your question, but in the seeds of some of the movements that we see, you see people as groups, as collectives saying, we've got to find a way just to show we do not accept this. We withdraw our cooperation. We're not complicit. And when young people go on school strikes, in a way, that's what they're doing. And maybe all of us in our different positions need to think about how we find ways to show we don't go along with a project that is killing people now, around the world now, that is displacing people on a vast scale now, while we put up our borders that block off people's escape routes. It is a brutal, brutal project. And because it's difficult, I don't think anyone can say, you must do this, and if you don't do that, you're guilty and you're complicit. That just builds up everybody's tension. But what I think we all have an obligation to do is make sure we properly understand what is happening and sincerely and critically think about how we can withdraw from that and communicate that publicly. And that doesn't necessarily mean throwing paint on oil paintings. That's somebody's way of doing it. But if that isn't the right way to do it, well, what's your way of doing it?
I suppose the response might be, if this is a conversation that's mostly happening on the left, and you're saying withdraw our attention, maybe our votes, our money, our support, our time from the system, there's a similar conversation that's happening on the right. Also, no longer believing institutions, no longer believing politicians. They're also saying withdraw. They have an alternate view on this particular topic, on many topics. So if everyone withdraws, what happens then?
Yeah. If I
You're at the epicenter of these withdrawals.
if I could add, since we've been talking so much about systems, one of my very favorite essays that gets to this point is Donella Meadows' Leverage Points Within a System. And she does get to this point at the end, and she recommends on this topic to simply continue to speak loudly and with assurance, and to not give up, to put people who agree with you in places of power. So it's not a simple solution, but it is a solution. And all movements for change have been based on that advice. So I think more of the same, and coming from decades, many decades of advocacy, I can see over time that it does make a difference if that helps. Maybe not as fast as we'd like, but speaking loudly and with assurance and continuing to get your message out and not giving up, I think, is the most straightforward way to do it.
A question for you, Linda. You're mentioning some examples in Ecuador, Colombia, about the rights of nature being implemented. Just curious if you know, like, what were the outcomes after those decisions, or if there were economic outcomes and or benefits after those decisions?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So it's Los Cedros, in the Intag Valley were generally areas activities that were opposed locally. So maybe there was some economic harm to the outside entities that wanted to come in and mine. And certainly the impacts were avoided at the natural system level. One example on the Colombia rights of nature case is my understanding, and again, I'm not the expert, but it's my understanding that some of the work that's been done to stop the deforestation has hit some roadblocks internally, because the logging provides some local jobs. And so when there are local jobs being threatened, then there's a concern, hey, we are supportive of climate change, addressing climate change, but, we need work. So there is some issue of encountering that type of a roadblock. These types of changes come slowly when your economic system is built on extraction. And so I think that there are examples like that, because the movement is growing slowly. There's not as many, but we'll certainly see them. And the book I mentioned earlier, The Politics of Rights of Nature, does get into some of those examples more deeply, if that's of interest.
Thank you. We have another in-person question for those on Zoom.
Yeah, so I was surprised and disappointed by a lot of the discussion this evening. And actually, Linda's remark just now sort of touches what I was expecting, which is, how do you legislate for the future? Legislate means legislate. No one has talked about that. The way to do this is to encourage people to run for, people who agree with, who want to save the planet, to run for office and vote laws that are do what you would like them to do. My goodness gracious. The way to do it is not to withdraw, but to take action and to stand up for what you want. And the title of the thing is legislating for the future. I haven't heard a word about legislating. All I've heard is the problem is not the courts. The courts deal with the laws. You want to change the laws. You want to legislate. How do you get legislatures to pass laws that are climate friendly and to reinforce them? The way to do that is to get people to run for office who want to do that, who will vote the laws. And then to tell people, to explain to people, yes, they're economic, to try to create programs that spread the economic pain as little as possible, and to explain and to continue and to do what Linda just said, but and to encourage young people to do that, because it's in their interest.
Well, first, before maybe you would like to take this, I'll absorb all full responsibility for the title, which I thought sounded quite catchy. And as I pointed out earlier, Fred, and as Linda pointed out in her email, that it's simply one way for us to talk about the very vast range of ways that law and lawmaking are relevant. But perhaps you can take the point on legislation. Sorry to just.
Sorry, I've done it again. We just take the US Congress. I mean, one of the obvious things that we're up against when we talk about legislating there is the power the fossil fuel industry has over Congress. It's a very familiar phenomenon. So it's not as simple as you vote for the person that you like who's going to change the laws. It's quite entrenched. The power, the wealth of the fossil fuel industry, and it's the same in the UK. So withdrawal in the sense of making space for alternatives. And I think after decades of trying to do exactly the sort of things you talked about, and people have been doing it for a long, long time, there is a mood in some quarters, which at least resonates with me, of people needing to do it for themselves. So you've heard, and we've heard in France about citizens' assemblies. This was something that emerged from grassroots movements. No one had heard about citizens' assemblies really before movements like Extinction Rebellion were talking about it. But then Macron institutes a citizens' assembly, 149 recommendations. He promises to implement all of them. He's implemented one. Right. So people have done all of those things, and the shift that leads us to is next time we'll be doing our own citizens' assembly. And when people, because governments have no power without the public, if people see authentically democratic processes, you know, real citizens' assemblies, people's courts, which produce the logical, rational decisions that are actually safeguarding life, enough people get on board with that, that will become powerful. So it is withdrawal in order to legislate for the future, recognizing that isn't going to happen through courts that are co-opted and in the pocket of the fossil fuel industry too much of the time.
Linda, perhaps we could turn to you too.
Yeah, and I agree with the points being made, and I would add on the citizens' assemblies on the rights of nature perspective, there are international rights of nature tribunals that have been held all over the world, trying to do that very same thing, trying to raise awareness of what a court system would look like that actually did take into account the human right to a healthy climate, nature's own rights to a healthy environment. You know, what are the violations and what would the remedies look like? Because there isn't that space, and modeled on the permanent people's tribunals. So that's another option to look at. And then with regard to legislation, there has been quite a lot of legislation on rights of nature. The Harmony with Nature, UN.org has a great list of that worldwide if folks want to take a look.
And maybe we can also depart from Fred's point to say that we could also talk more about this word future, which was also well chosen and not because it was only catchy, how to represent unborn voices, very young voices, how to anticipate the needs and the troubles of decades to come. So maybe Mac, if you would like to jump in there and talk about this question of the importance of listening to younger people because they'll be the future.
Yes, of course. Sorry, I have had some technical issues with my computer. So yes, firstly, I think that the question that was asked was really interesting, because I mean, right now it is important to talk about the future, because I think this is the main reason why we have all of these discussions about climate change. It is because we also want change in legislation, the decisions which are taken. And to be honest, I have no answer on how to promote young people, because when you think about it, it is really difficult to enter political spheres to, like, even when you enter it, your voice is just one from many. So I think that it is important to engage yourself in some way, to be informed. So you can also point out the paradoxical speeches that our politicians can have, and to try to make this change. And I think that one of the most important things would actually to, like Linda, have a technical background, because climate change is a bioclimatic change. So it is important to know what you talk about in order to defend it. And I think it is also what is lacking a lot in the political sphere and in the sphere of the people who are making the decisions of tomorrow. It is the fact that they are most of the time technically not so much trained. And I think that this is one of the issues that should be dealt with, to have people who are experienced in the field, they are taking decisions in.
Yeah, and maybe
Really?
we might add that they're not sufficiently trained, and also they're operating, and you hear this again and again in this discourse about this conversation, that the time scale that we're operating on, whether as a politician or as a journalist, is a short-term time frame, and these are long-term
Yes,
problems.
exactly.
She said yes, exactly.
I'm sorry. I wanted to say something, but the mic was cut off. But yes, I think it is important to have people who are going to take long-term decisions, and to also maybe try to avoid situation like turning doors, because I think that it is also one of the major reasons of corruption when you think about it in the sphere of politics. It is the fact that you have people coming from private sectors into this into the public sector, and they know that they might go back into the private sector, basically. So this is also a major problem I think should be dealt with, and yeah, to have people who are less biased. But I have no concrete way of solving this problem, obviously.
Thanks so much to our three speakers. I have a question. I think when I think of law, I think a lot about the interaction, and you all alluded to this a little bit about the interaction between international law, national law, federal law, and also local laws. And I'm wondering if, when we're legislating for the future, are these very complementary? What are the tensions that exist there? Because we talked about Santa Monica, that's obviously like a local success, but how does that look, and how do we make sure that all of these levels are working together? And then as a side note, if there's time, I'm curious about your work, Tim, for the small island nations and what you did for them.
Coming on a bit on that. Well, so the first question about the interaction of those laws. Well, in a globalized world, which is what we've got, I mean, logically, international law should be at the top of that hierarchy, because that defines the remit for national legislatures. And the basic principle is you have control over your own domestic resources, because if we believe in sovereignty, that's what sovereignty means. But then the flip side of that is you respect other territories. That is already the law. And the reason that law isn't upheld, and I've been involved a little bit in some of the discussions with some of the island states who've been asking themselves for decades, is this the right time to bring a legal action against the countries that are violating this basic principle of international law? Because they know we are going under because of their actions. And the reason they've not brought that action is not because of the law. It's not because the legal advice has been, that isn't a strong principle that you can rely on here. It's been because of the politics. In other words, those island states heavily indebted because they've had to follow economic programs pushed on them by the World Bank and others. And it's really hard paying off that debt. And if you upset your benefactors by bringing legal action against them, you've got a political problem, not a legal problem. And you then asked kindly about my experience as a lawyer at COP21 in Paris. The big thing that was going on there was horse trading, as you would expect when you've got, nearly 200 governments trying to make a deal. What the US delegation and the Canadian delegation and the EU delegation were saying was, if you want that 1.5 limit in the agreement, in other words, you want to survive, you need to sign away your legal rights. We need a provision in the Paris Agreement that says, we will deal with this amicably, we will never sue you, because the countries were scared that would be, countries with power were scared that would be legally enforceable. And so my role, along with others, was to create an outcry against that blackmail, which is what it was, so that clause didn't get through. So legally, you could still bring that action, but we haven't got an answer to the politics just yet.
Linda, perhaps we could pose the same question to you. You could speak about the relationship between your work in Santa Monica and then American law broadly understood as that relates to international law.
Yeah, I mean, my experience before Rights of Nature, when I was doing more traditional environmental advocacy, was to use every tool in the toolbox that I could. Administrative rulemaking, lawsuits, state legislation, federal legislation, whatever happened to have the potential to work, the more tools at the same time I found were more effective. And I think that's the same, it's true, today in with regard to climate change. You work at every level you can with consistent messages. I mean, that's key. I just, as we were just talking, I don't see anything significant coming out of our Congress anytime soon, but we can work at the local level. And in some places where advocates are working, they're trying to get enough local laws passed to be able to move up to the state level and pass either a state constitutional amendment or some sort of state law. Some folks are working at that level. Some folks are working, for example, up in Washington state, getting local communities to pass laws and resolutions in support of the rights of orcas and the rights of the oceans, and translating that up to a more international agreement, more soft law. Around the rights of the oceans and the rights of orcas. So, there's a significant number of potential interactions, but overall, they allow you to be able to get your message out and in a consistent way. And then finally, on the point earlier about politics and lawmaking, if you run for Congress, you're one of many, and it's quite challenging. And in a state the size of California, that's also to a lesser extent true at the state level, but certainly at a local level, where people feel the impacts, like I felt the impacts of that local creek that was getting impacted by tannery waste. Local politicians can do a lot of good, and those cities can create models for other cities and then other states and nations worldwide. So I think the local level is one way that Rights of Nature is spreading, in part because of that, the opportunities and also the impacts that people are feeling and seeing locally.
And maybe, Linda, you could speak to how in a country, let's say, so there was a recent Rights of Nature case in the Blue Mountains in Australia, and this part of Australia was aware that this more local Rights of Nature ordinance was one of the first in the country. And so they were very deliberate about the structure with which they created the ordinance, because they knew that it would set a precedent that would likely be copied by other local places. Can you talk about the way that local areas affect one another and the importance of precedent in this interconnected system?
Yes, just in general, it gets to what's interesting about for example, the rights of nature movement, is that because it is so grassroots and developing, we do see different structures and processes arising. So some ordinances, local ordinances, will talk simply about a right to exist, whereas others may talk about a right to flourish. Some will be tied to a specific activity, like, for example, coal mining, and prohibit the coal mining and say that the community has a right and the nature has right to be free from the impacts of coal mining, but not addressing other things as well. And some will talk about rights, some will talk about legal personhood. All of these are ways to reflect the context, what's going on locally and why these concerns are coming up and why people are taking action. And so in some situations you see people really focusing on a model that others can use, but others might not want or be able to use those models. For example, the legal personhood approach used in New Zealand need to be tied to Maori cosmology. So a rights-based approach wasn't necessarily the right approach, whereas a legal personhood approach was. So I do think it's important to be consistent in your overarching messages, but recognize that there's context and that we need to respect not only the people that live locally, but also the natural systems that are locally, and try our best to listen and hear what they need as well.
We have another in-person question. Alfonso is walking briskly to the person.
I was very shocked to hear about the Supreme Court decision regarding Heathrow Airport. I find that scandalous, and I kind of feel that most the British people would agree with me. So why did I have to come here to find it out?
Yeah. Of course, the first part, that's easy, isn't it? Of course, it's scandalous. But there was a truth about it, that if you were literally, when that Court of Appeal decision came out, I got a bit overexcited, and I was talking to media outlets like the New York Times, and I was saying that Court of Appeal judgment, that was the sound of the bell tolling on the carbon economy. Because if that judgment had stood and it had become law, the government couldn't do anything inconsistent with 1.5 degrees, well, that would have been the bell tolling on the carbon economy, because we are almost out of time for 1.5 degrees. So none of those big infrastructure projects that we define ourselves on in our global north economies, that we define our whole political project, they would all have to stop. And you don't usually get a revolution through the courts. And when what we need is a whole-scale transformation of society, in some ways, I shouldn't have been surprised at what happened at the Supreme Court, because otherwise, through the courts, we would have had something like a revolution. It would have been unlawful to breach the Paris Agreement. That's what it would have meant.
Can you say that so the Zoom audience can hear you? Thank you.
Are there instances in which the Paris Agreement gets referenced at a domestic level? Like, does it hold any weight?
It gets referenced all the time in all these cases, but what you have around the Paris Agreement is a sort of false accounting, where the only legal requirement is for governments to lodge what's called a nationally determined contribution, which is their self-assessment at what's needed. And for the UK, for example, because it's a post-industrial economy, we import most of our goods from China. We count the embedded carbon in that against China and go, oh, look, it's China emitting all the carbon, not us. So there are just ways that clever governments find to get round it. So it gets referenced, but it doesn't really have teeth. And I think most of the public who's interested enough to follow this understands governments are not acting on it. It's words not backed up by their actions.
Yes, we have time for one more question. Are there any on Zoom, Alfonso? I wonder.
Yes,
Okay,
there-
well, let's leave the last word to our Zoom audience because we did promise that.
There was one for Irmak. You said that the Climate Academy was advised to you by a professor. Would you recommend it for other students to attend? And if so, what organization would be good to get in contact with?
Okay, so actually the Climate Academy has to be established in a school to, to perform. It's not an online stuff or anything. So you can just Google it, Google the climateacademy.org, and you will find the website. And on the website, you can also, there is a nugget where it's written, join the academy, and you can start your own academy. And there are manuals and books about different subjects. So yes.
Thank you. And I should add that Plan B, Environment Now also have great resources that you can check out online. If I'm sure you have many further questions, or that at least they'll come up in the days to come. And the resources for all of these organizations are very robust and impressive and worth spending some time to read. Can we have a big round of applause, please, for everyone this evening? Thank you.